my name is Shelby Fleming. Welcome to my studio today at Mount Sequoyah. Got our nice little windows there. Today you'll be joining me for a plaster demo and how to mix and a few construction ideas on how to work with plaster. Let's get going! Today we're going to be working with Plaster Paris. You can find it at Lowe's or Home Depot. This particular one I picked up at Lowe's. And they have it in a box. It's actually in the paint aisle, and my guess is it's in a box because people were ripping the bags when they would pick them up to take them. Pretty cheap and affordable for how far the actual material goes. Next I'm going to show you guys some of the tools you might need. For setup, our studio has a cool bathroom. Woo! With a window, but what I've done, I put a lot of plastic down in the tub so that we don't get plaster everywhere. We have our bag here that came in that box that we just talked about. A few other things I like to have. Container that has some measurements on it, which will become important because we'll be mixing a kind of a ratio of how much plaster per water that we'll be mixing a day. Some other things, if you don't want to get your hands completely dirty, maybe a spoon or something to mix the plaster with the water. And then because we're going to be using some fabric and some of the techniques, a little pan, that way we can take our fabric pieces and just kind of lay it in there and take it back out. Another thing you might want is a plaster bucket just to wash your hands off in. You'll see that the plaster starts to settle at the bottom of the bucket. We don't want that to end up in your drain, because then you'll have a major, problem. So before we get started mixing the plaster, we want to set up our workstation. It's going to be very messy, just forewarning. So you might decide to do this outside, or you might on your activity table, you might put down some plastic so that the plaster doesn't go everywhere. In this case, I put plaster down on my studio table. And what I've decided that I'm going to do is I have a bowl on the underside of the plastic, and I'm going to use that as a curved surface. And I have these little strips of just yarn and some pantyhose fabric. And we're going to dip that in the plaster and put it around the form so we get a little bit of a curve and see what happens there. Some other things we're going to do. We're going to fill up this container just with our leftover plaster, and then I'm going to show you guys how to actually carve plaster and some things we can use to do that. Before we pour plaster in there, we might want to do a release. So in the sense of plaster 2-part molds or 3-part molds, which I could show in a different video, we want to put a release on it so it will release from the plastic so that it doesn't get permanently stuck in there in all of the creases. A few good release options is Murphy's oil. It's in the cleaning aisle. You can water that down and just use like a paintbrush and wipe it in there. What I'm going to use today is petroleum jelly. It's a good release, but then also if you're worried about your skin cracking while you're or plaster getting stuck in your fingers, if you're deciding not to mix with gloves on today, you can actually put this on your hands too, and it acts as a good release for the plaster so your hands don't get completely dried out. Yeah, so I will, off camera, I'll do that before we start mixing our plaster. And why do we do this on the front end? Because plaster starts to set up within 10 minutes. And I'll show you, as it starts to set up, we can start to create some really cool textures and start to actually model with it as well. Okay, now we're back in the bathroom. We're going to start mixing our plaster. So again, have our nice little bowl, and I'm just going to fill it up with some water. And since we're only doing a small amount of plaster, I'm only going to mix it up to probably the half of 1 liter. So you can see very minimum amount of water, and you'll see how much it creates once we start adding our plaster. As you're mixing plaster, you're going to want to wear a face mask because as this plumes up, it is a powder. Plaster is a powder, so it is going to kind of get in the air a little bit, and you don't want to upset your respiratory system. Again, probably another good idea to do it outside or near a ventilated space. So I have my face mask. I'm going to put that on, but first I'm going to explain what's going to happen. I have a little scoop in here. I'm going to scoop it out in here, and I'll show the camera. What we're aiming for is that the water slowly creates an island as we add plaster. And once we see a little island of plaster, then we start to back off a little bit on adding any more plaster because the water can only take in so much powder at a time. And once it, I give it like the 5-second rule. If the island doesn't disappear within 5 seconds, that means you have enough plaster in it. So I'll show you and go back and forth with that. And I just put my mask on. And we're gonna go dig into our plaster bag. And you don't just want to plop it in there, you kind of want to sift it around the whole container as you're adding it. It did plunk a little bit, but that's fine. Add some more. And you see we don't have an island going yet. We just have water still. Sift it in there. We still don't really have a buildup yet. Again, this is like 4 to 5 scoops in, and you can see how much plaster the water can absorb. Now, see, we still had the start of an island, but it's starting to go away. Definitely means we need more. But we're starting to get there, so I'm going to slow down on how much I'm adding at a time. Okay, we got one good island in there. We can kind of see it right there. And I'm going to add one more little sifty scoop, see if it starts to island around the whole entire container first. See how it just kind of settles on the top a little bit, kind of like cinnamon on milk. There we go. That's what we're looking for. A little dash of more. I like mine a little thicker, so. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5-ish. A little bit more, and then I think we'll be good. There we go. Now that's just staying right on top. So I think we're good. So we're going to start mixing now. Now again, you might have a spoon. Some people prefer to use their hands. You can use a stick, whatever you prefer. I have this nice little thing. I don't even know what it's called. On the handle it says Good Cook. I'm assuming it's a Pamper Chef item that's used to mix up juice or just, general mashed potatoes, but I use it for plaster. The main thing is if you are making a really large batch of plaster, you want to make sure all the lumps are out of it. Because we don't want lumps to end up in our mold. Especially if we're just pouring a mold to carve later. We don't want any air pockets or bubbles. We want a nice, smooth, creamy mix. How long to mix it? Until it's smooth and we don't see any more dry material in the water. Well, in the plaster now. So you can see it's a nice quite sour cream. A little bit thinner than sour cream. And that looks good. And now we'll head back to our workstation. And remember that we only have about a 10 to 15 minute window to use this plaster before it starts to set up. Okay, we're back in our workstation. Now we're going to start, I think I'll start with the yarn first, and we're just going to kind of dip it into our plaster. And the cool part about plaster is you can also tint it too. I found that acrylic or watercolor, like liquid watercolor, works really well. And you can actually add it to your plaster to add some color. But plaster is so versatile that you can paint it afterwards with whatever paint you would like. So spray paint, acrylic's good. We think about frescoes. They were basically adding paint to plaster and then adding that to the wall. Okay, so I'm making sure that all my string is coated. And for today, we're just experimenting, so we're not aiming for anything in particular as we're doing this. Whee! And you can see that it's really, really thin right now. And it will start to thicken up. Again, since we have such a small amount of materials we're doing right now, you don't really need that pan that I showed earlier. We're just working from the container to save some time. We got some cool line work going right there. Now let's try our pantyhose. See what that does. Now this is just strips of pantyhose that I've cut down that I just had in my studio. So this will probably give us a thicker line. So I'm just making sure we have plaster all over this strip. Now, say I ran out of plaster in the middle of doing this, I could mix new plaster. But if I'm going to add it onto old plaster, I would want to use a spray bottle of water and just lightly spray the piece before I add any new pieces. Cool. And there's our thicker line. That's fun. And then this one's all tied together, so we're just going to dunk it and see what happens. It's like washing hair. Okay, here we go. Woo! Big old mess. And again, you don't have to put a bowl under it. It can be flat. I just thought it would be nice to have a nice little curve on this piece. There we go. Nope. You have one more little string. Do that one. There we go. Awesome. Now we have a little bit of plaster left. I'm going to pour it into our bowl, but we're going to save a little bit of plaster in the container so I can show you guys how to sculpt with it a little bit before it sets up. So again, remember we have our petroleum jelly in the bottom. Or we added petroleum jelly to the mold, that way it releases easier. I have a little bit left. I'll come back with you guys and show you how you can do some modeling techniques as it starts to set up. Now, since we're going to be working reductive with this mold, while it's still wet, liquid state, we want to kind of bang the container a little bit to try and get the air bubbles out. You'll see like it starts to come to the surface, the air bubbles do. In a smaller mold like this, it's not as prevalent or not as necessary. But once you get into larger molds, you might use a hammer and bang the table, just like a soft mallet, or have something, if you're doing like a wooden mold, you'd bang the edges of the mold. That way all the bubbles start to come to the surface. And we can kind of see them coming up. There they are. So that's pretty good. We're kind of in a heavy cream stage currently. But you can see what that looks like. I've grabbed a little piece of MDF wood. And we can start to build up a little bit. Again, as you're cleaning your tools and everything, I recommend having a bucket to wash your hands in, and then wash out all of your tools. That way it doesn't clog up your drain. If you're working outside, you might use a hose and just kind of spray everything off in the yard. Now, depending on what kind of plaster you're purchasing, you will notice that it goes through a chemical reaction as it dries. So if you feel it, it's going to have some heat to it. And generally how you tell when a mold, when you are pouring a block, how you tell if it's done or cured fully is the top will be a little bit colder. Right now it still has a little bit of heat. We might be able to get it out of the mold still, but we're going to look at some other things that are available. So we just used cloth and dipped it in plaster, but there is another product available. I believe Hobby Lobby and Michaels and Blick have this, but basically it's a mesh, and it already has plaster in these little mesh surfaces. And with this one, you're able to just dunk it in water and then put it over whatever form you want to. So it kind of expedites the process, but it's a little bit more expensive. If you're doing a really large bulk project, I would recommend the plaster Paris process that we just did. But for the sake of convenience, mess, and maybe if you're working with kids, this might be a great introduction. So again, it comes in a little roll, so you can roll it out. You can use scissors and cut it to whatever you want. You can drape it over forms. You could probably even staple it to a form and then add water to it, but that's another option. But we're gonna try and take our piece out of this one without destroying it. I'll be right back. Okay, with our petroleum jelly, it slid right out of the mold, so that's good. If it was stuck, I would recommend taking a knife or maybe a dowel rod and then just like go around the edges, kind of like a cake, and then just popping it out. But in this case, we have a mold that doesn't have too big of a lip. Sometimes you get what's called an undercut. I don't think I have an example on my desk, but say this was like pushed inward and then the plaster went around it, it would be very hard for it to come out, correct? So in that case, you would have to cut apart the container in order to use it. A lot of people have done projects like this where they'll take recycled materials such as like old water bottles and then fill them with plaster and cut them apart to make different narratives about recycling. Or you could do like a partial fill of the mold in order to get some really cool textures. So we have our block here, and we can see that it recorded the imprint that was on the bottom of this container quite well. And then it looks like we don't have a whole lot of air bubbles. What we do have on the bottom, however, we can kind of see it did pick up some of the wrinkling that was on the bottom of the container. And in this case, it recorded another scratch that was on the bottom of the container. But for the most part, I'm not seeing a whole lot of air bubbles, which is good. So what we're going to do, we're going to start doing a little bit of carving into this piece. A few things I have here, just some really cheap, just carving, wood carving set, little carving set. That's a good introductory set if you want to get into carving. With a few different blades, because these could be used for wood carving, printmaking. I wouldn't recommend mixing mixing between different things because of cross-contamination, and you probably don't want plaster going into your wood block print. But so you have our little weave bit, some various gouges, but we're just gonna play around with some of these. Some other options are some just like general hooks. There's also they sell packs of kind of dental tools, which are fun to play with. You can find these at Harbor Freight, or you can order them off of Amazon. And we'll play around with some of these too. And when I'm carving with the gouge, I want to make sure that all my fingers are behind the direction that I'm carving. I don't want to do this because I might carve into my hand, and I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to make sure all my hands are behind it. And we can see that's super soft to carve. And again, I'm not carving anything in particular today. We're just playing around. Or prototyping. So again, we're getting a general feel for the tools, but we're not really making anything in particular. So we're going to come back and I'll show you some finishes we can use on this. So we're back with our just regular paint, and this is kind of what we carved. And what I'm going to do, I'm just going to use the green and kind of go into the carved area. And then I'm going to go over the top with shoe polish, actually. If you want more of like a natural look or something that looks kind of bony, I would recommend shoe polish, and you can use acetone as kind of your spreader. But I think we'll just use straight up shoe polish today. I don't have acetone in the studio. You can see we can quickly get some nice color in here and make it feel like it's not even plaster anymore. Now, not to be confused, this cannot go outside when it's done. Plaster will disintegrate if we were to throw it back in water. So again, we could work backwards, and before our plaster sets up, when we're in the mixing phase, we could add some paint into the plaster mix. Just remember, you'd have to add a lot of paint, quite a bit of paint, because it will change the color. So if I were to add a drop of green to a lot of white, it would be a very light green. So keeping that in mind. If you're going to use liquid watercolor to add in with your plaster, I would add that in when you are adding water to your bucket. And then another thing we can do, which I forgot to demonstrate, is we can come back over with some sandpaper or just like a really rough surface, and we can get some different textures. You see it adds a little bit of a different surface onto it. Just give us a little bit of something extra to work with. It's kind of gumming up our sandpaper right now because it's not fully set up. Generally, when you're making a block like that, you might want to wait a couple hours before carving it if you're doing something very refined. For us, it's not a huge deal because we were just playing with the plaster and seeing what it could do today. Okay, so that gives us an idea of what our acrylic can do on the surface. So this was latex, just house paint. You can use acrylic. Some people use watered down acrylic, works really well. But we're gonna do our shoe polish next. We have our shoe polish. It's a little bit oranger than I thought. I picked up a brown, but this is what we have, so we're gonna see what that does on the surface. So that gives us a little bit of an orange tint. And for this one, I was aiming for just the highlights to be. Maybe we'll try the black. We have our black shoe polish. We're going to try that now. And again, I'm just going to go a little bit over the surface. Not aiming to get the inside cracks because I really want the carving to pop. There we go. That's kind of what I'm looking for. Have kind of that, some of that charcoal color. But really the sky's for limit once the plaster's set up. You can really just work in whatever you want on the surface. So that kind of gives us a little bit of pop there. Okay. And then we're going to check out our plaster piece over here. So we just lifted the plaster piece right off of the bucket because we have our plastic down, so that acts as our release, but here it is. I'm just going to set it down because the back is really interesting too. So this is the back side. And our front side. Thank you for joining me today in my studio at Mount Sequoyah. And I want to thank the Bridge Fund Grant and Cache for making this possible today. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to me at shelbylynnfleming@gmail.com. My website is shelbylynnfleming.com, or you can find me on Instagram at shelbylynnfleming. See ya! Till next time!